Hello and welcome to the Inside Risk and Compliance podcast. I'm your host, Adam Spencer, Director of AJ Fox Compliance, a specialist recruitment agency focusing on all things law firm risk and compliance. I have seen so many people carve amazing and fulfilling careers in this space, and it really has been a pleasure speaking to people who enjoy doing what they do every day. However, one thing that has really stood out to me is how hard it can be for people to access the bigger picture outside of their team, outside of their firm. We created this podcast to share with you some of the insights, experiences, and stories of the most interesting people succeeding inside risk and compliance. In this episode, we're joined by Suzie Ogilvie, a seasoned financial crime, sanctions and risk consultant and former global head of compliance at Freshfields. To explore a career at the intersection of law, policy and purpose, Suzie reflects on her move from private practice into the then emerging world of law firm compliance and how her interest in regulation and risk evolved into a long and rewarding career focused on AML, sanctions and financial crime. We discuss the real-world challenges of applying complex legislation, the value of informal training and peer collaboration, and Suzie's experience influencing policy at the European level through her work with the Council of European Bars. Packed with practical advice for aspiring compliance professionals, this episode is a must-listen for anyone looking to build a career that combines technical expertise with meaningful impact. Enjoy. Suzie, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you, Adam.
Awesome. Well, it's good to have you here. For the benefit of our listeners, can you just give us a brief overview of who you are and what you do at the moment, and then we'll dive into how you got there.
So I'm Suzie Ogilvie. I'm working as a consultant in financial crime, sanctions and general risk compliance, and I advise firms on all of those areas, as well as undertaking audits of AML and sanctions, and also some training.
Awesome. Sounds good. Okay. And you've had a pretty amazing career across a few different law firms, and previously were working in private practice. So I'd be quite keen to go back to the very beginning, I guess, in terms of, you know, qualifying into as a business restructuring and insolvency.
That's right.
And how that led you to risk and compliance.
So I qualified there. I had done a number of seats, but that was the one that really appealed to me because of the broad area of focus. And I learned so much as a result of that, although it was on the reverse side, just unpicking transactions. But I saw such a broad area and broad range. In terms of why I moved into risk and compliance, as a junior and sort of mid-level restructuring lawyer, my life was essentially at a desk.
Right.
And I spent a significant amount of time there. And part of the reason that I moved over was my father wasn't very well. He was long-term ill. And he had, it was very difficult balancing, seeing family at a time that I needed to see him with the unpredictability of working in business restructuring and insolvency space. And as it happened around that time, Allen and Overy, where I was working at the time, was starting up their risk and compliance function. And so I was effectively one of the first people to move into A&O's, now A&O Chairman's risk and compliance function.
Cool. And we'll definitely talk about that role, that first role in risk and compliance. But I was interested to ask whether your role in private practice in business restructuring and insolvency would have put you in a position to see fraud and corruption in businesses. Was that ever the driving force behind the reason a business was needing to be restructured and going through insolvency?
Yeah, that's right. There were a number of situations in which you would uncover fraud or some sort of financial irregularities. And so, we did see situations like that. One situation which springs to mind, which wasn't so much about fraud, but where the crossover is between the work that I was doing in private practice and also the risk and compliance space, was when we were approached by an individual who bizarrely had a donut business in Germany, supplying donuts to the army, the US Army based in Germany.
Very niche.
And obviously the US Army had decided that they were going to pull out of Germany, and he was wondering what to do with his business and how he might survive. And I just recall at the time there was a huge panic over whether or not this individual was some sort of fraudster and who was taking us for a ride. But in the end, we didn't do that piece of work. But partly because he was a very, very small businessman, and it wasn't really the sort of work that we would do. But it was an interesting sort of crossover. And it wasn't long after those discussions about sort of understanding who the person was, their source of funds and, ability to pay, that I moved over into the risk and compliance function.
So had that actually put risk and compliance on your radar then as a concept, as a career path? I know obviously there were, you gave the reasons why you made the move, but...
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that made it sort of sound more interesting than... perhaps, just moving and going in-house in another business. So, it was something that sparked a little bit of interest, just going through that and trying to understand and look at, the background and work out if somebody was a fraudster or not, or was...
was genuinely selling donuts to the US Army in Germany.
Yeah, precisely.
And how was that role? When you arrived then, what existed already from a risk and compliance perspective? And then how did you find transitioning into that type of work?
So there had been a very new business acceptance unit that had been set up. And that had been largely off the back of issues around sort of looking at conflicts of interest and people moving away from this idea that the partners needed to manage those conflicts of interest and having a centralised team. And then the anti-money laundering regulations had come into force. And so there was a business acceptance function. It was relatively new. And then there was a sort of a wider risk and compliance function that was being started up. It was really, a partner had been asked to take on the challenge of setting up this function. And so that was where the expansion started to happen.
And how did you fit into that team then when you started?
In essence, I was just really asked, what are you interested in? And I think the anti-money laundering piece was something that I found quite, it was something that was new. It was something that I could get my teeth stuck into. It was also an area that people didn't really want to touch because of the fact that it was criminal legislation and they were a little bit apprehensive about getting involved in that side of things. So I sort of agreed to take on that mantle, but I was also looking at conflicts of interest as well and pretty much anything else that would come my way effectively. But I really took on that piece of work and decided to drive that forward.
And how did you find the transition from being a fee earner to working in risk and compliance and fee earners being, your clients effectively?
I must admit, the first thing that was great about moving over was not having to do timesheets. But I think moving within the firm that I had been working for a number of years was actually quite helpful. People knew me as well, and they had trust in me, and so they would come to me and ask questions, and I think that was quite good as a bridge. And I think that's an important part of being involved in a risk and compliance team. People having that trust in you and being able to feel like they can ask you the questions. I remember when I joined Freshfields, a partner who I briefly met through a training session that I'd given, had phoned me up and said, Suzie, I have a very stupid question. Turned out it wasn't such a stupid question. And in essence, we had to speak to a number of people in law enforcement about that issue. But I think that's a really important part, having those relationships so that people feel that they can speak to you and pick up the phone and discuss issues with you.
And how do you develop that level of trust then if you're new? I guess it's nice you had pre-established relationships being what was it, 8 PQE at A&O, but how would you advise someone to go about building those relationships internally to get that trust?
I think there are a number of things that you can do. Having training and the need to give training also, will put your face in front of many people if it is face-to-face. There will always be issues that come up, and I always say to people, don't hide behind email. It's good to call someone, do a Teams call or a phone call if you need to, depending on whether they're external to the office at the time, and build up that rapport. It's very, very important to not sit there and just think it is much easier email people. Obviously, being in a risk and compliance function, if you have given some advice, you would obviously follow it up with an email. But I think those conversations are incredibly important.
Cool. And then how did your role sort of develop at Allen & Overy?
So I spent a number of years there, and effectively I worked on conflicts and on the anti-money laundering compliance, and I attended a number of the fora that were set up by other firms to discuss, a combined module for training that to be rolled out, and I think that was really it was a great place to be, because there was some sort of it was almost like a therapy session at times to talk about issues and practical appliance and of the rules and regulations and setting industry standards at that time, when there really wasn't anything else out there to give guidance on what you should and shouldn't be doing under the regulations.
So when you say a module, so who? So you said a number of firms were coming together to put training together. So in what sense, who was going to be delivering that training?
It was an online e-learning module working with a e-learning provider.
Interesting. And did you see that through to fruition then?
Yeah, it has been rolled out, and that company is rather successful in selling their products now to many law firms and I believe other professional services firms.
Can we say who that company is?
Vinci.
Oh, that's Vinci. Yeah. Okay, cool, awesome. So that must have been an interesting project to be involved with, and I can totally imagine how nice a space it must have been for people to be able to share sort of Chatham House rules, share what's going on in there.
I mean, credit has to go to some of the, there were some people who were really driving that forward, and then there were others like us, like me, who were effectively inputting. But there were certain individuals who really took on the mantle to do the bulk of the work, and credit has to go to them for that.
And was there a point at your time at A&O, because you were there for a little while, right?
I was in the risk and compliance function there for 2-3 years or so.
And was there a point at which you realised, or maybe it was immediate, this is it. I can see myself staying in risk and compliance for the rest of my career. This is where I'm going to, plant my flag.
I don't know. I think I was always sort of, just see how things go. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that. So when I actually moved over into risk and compliance, I recall the partner who was in charge of the business restructuring and insolvency department. He said to me, Suzie, people like you, you end up working these same long hours. Because it's in your blood. So you'll just end up working those long hours. And actually the hours were better at that time, although, his words came true when we had the ramp up of sanctions against Russia in 2014. And then again, the huge influx of sanctions in 2022 onwards. But I must admit, I never thought I would move into risk and compliance. So I've always been fairly open-minded about what the next step is. Yeah,
interesting. I mean, so many people we speak to, they, for want of a better word, phrase, they fall into risk and compliance, but then they never look back and they stay in that space, and it's, provides a very fulfilling career. So you stayed at Allen & Overy for nearly 8 years and then moved to Linklaters, is that right?
I was there for just over a year.
Okay, how did that compare? How was that different to A&O, another Magic Circle firm?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I wasn't there that long. It was a slightly different setup in terms of the way things were operated within business acceptance, for example. But people talk about firms being much of a much-ness. The setup of some of the departments are occasionally quite different, but they're all achieving the same aim, and they all have they all have similar challenges, which is effectively, how do you actually integrate with the practice so that they don't see you as just a cost center. They see you as some, department that can provide some value. And so, I think they operated things slightly differently, but you could see some of the same issues cropping up there as was happened at A&O and at Freshfields.
Yeah, no, I bet. And then you did move to Freshfields, which was your home for a long time. So tell us a little bit about the move to Freshfields, and then how your role developed there, over the years?
So I had known my predecessor at Freshfields, and he had said that he was moving back home to Australia, and I sort of asked about the position, and he had effectively gone back after I was just out for a drink with him and some others, and he had gone back and said, "Oh, would you be interested in Suzie applying?" I applied and got the role, and spent a long time there. Initially, the role was just principally focused on anti-money laundering, but as you saw more and more financial crime regulation and sanctions became more prevalent within the European Union and the UK, that role sort of kept expanding.
Yeah.
And it also kept that interest up, that constant learning, and that learning new areas and having new challenges. So that was really quite exciting.
And what was it that made you decide to focus on that side of things? It sounds like you moved away from the complex aspects of the role and focused on AML and then financial crime and sanctions. So was there a reason that you focused in that direction?
I think it was just the area that had really interested me more. There were lots of different scenarios came up. There was lots of situations where you had to be commercial about risks, etc. And you see that in conflicts. But I think that this was an area where there was a lot more nuance in some of the legislation. It was developing constantly, and so it was just a particular interest to me.
Yeah.
Just having that constant movement, the constant development, and the constant excitement of something new coming along.
Yeah. And how did you stay on top of all of that? And how, I guess if listeners are finding themselves in a scenario where they feel like they are constantly behind in terms of that learning piece or new regulations or changes coming out, have you got tips or advice on how to stay on top of things?
Look, I think that we're at a stage where there's so much now. It is challenging, and I think therefore you have to have some other people that can support you on that, and you can also, and this goes back to the point about value with the business, you can also work with the business on particular areas. Take sanctions, for example.
Yep.
It's an area where you're not only advising clients, but you have to get your compliance right. And so therefore you might work with people within the business on the knowledge side, as well as other people in the business, and discuss those areas, and that's a way of keeping on top of it. There are also other forums that you can go along to, like we had in the very beginning when we focused on training. You can attend forums and just sort of catch up from that perspective. But no, I don't underestimate the challenge. It is hugely challenging at the moment, with more and more increasing focus on regulation and increasing regulations.
Definitely. And obviously your role progressed at Freshfields, and before you left you were global head. Yep. What was that like, sitting at that position at Freshfields? How did you find that?
It is, obviously it's challenging, and obviously with a global role it's more difficult to find the time to just have some downtime in the evenings, because you've got people who are online, people who need support, and when you wake up first thing in the morning, you've got a raft of things that have come through overnight, and people effectively with new questions. And I think, but it gave such an array of different issues that cropped up around the world, and I think some of the things that I have done were helpful in that respect. So, for example, I worked, on the European side, I worked very closely with on the AML committee of the Council of European Bars.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah.
What is the European Council of Bars?
So they're known as the CCBE for short. The Council of European Bars is the collective of all of the European law societies and bar associations, and they have a number of committees, and they focus on the particular area of their committee, but they look at the legislation, they look at how they might be able to support the profession in those areas as well. So it's a little bit like the anti-money laundering offering of the Law Society of England and Wales, where they had their money laundering task force now rebranded and rebadged, where that task force was there to support the profession as well, but to also engage with government on new laws and engage on new guidance as well.
I just wanted to take a moment out to thank our amazing sponsor, the International Compliance Association. The ICA are the leading professional body for the global regulatory and financial crime community, offering professional qualifications, world-class events and training. Go check them out online, and if any of the certificates or courses take your fancy, then you can get 10% discount using our code AJFOX10 at checkout. And how did you actually find yourself in that position? How does one get involved with the Council of European Bars? We've got a lot of people progressing careers, wanting to get involved in other things on a sort of, I guess it's quasi extracurricular, isn't it? But how did you secure that?
So that was actually through the Law Society of England and Wales. It was actually an appointment on behalf of all of the UK law societies.
Okay, interesting.
But at that time, the Law Society of England and Wales had been a lot more active on that stage. And I was effectively nominated to go, and you go through an internal nomination process, and I cleared it.
Yeah, nice.
I'm not sure if there were any other competitors in that process, but yeah. So at that time, it was very much a sort of a nomination through the Law Society of England and Wales. I suppose it maybe helped somewhat with the Law Society of Scotland that I come from that part of the world as well, but I'm not sure.
And I'm very ignorant to the different approaches of other European countries, but how aligned were they, or was it?
When I started, it was quite interesting because I think we had got to a position in the UK where we'd lost the battle on whether or not the profession was going to be subject to anti-money laundering regulation. And those battles still continue, for example, in the US. But we
when
had
you say
effectively
lost the battle, as in to ask for them not to be subject?
Yeah, or to have a much lesser sort of compliance.
Right,
And at that time, you still had a number of the bar associations very, very against this idea that they would be subject to anti-money laundering regulation, and they followed, case law in the European Court of Human Rights on this, and it was quite interesting at the time because people were in very, very different positions, and I think that changed over the years where people realized it wasn't going away. And I think, the Mossack Fonseca Panama Papers issue really brought people around to realizing they were never going to win that battle, so to speak, and that they would be subject to formal anti-money laundering requirements for the foreseeable future.
Now, it sounds like a really interesting experience to be part of that. And how long did you do that for?
I was on that committee, I think, for 14 years, 13 to 14 years, yeah.
How did it feel stepping down? Were you glad to be was it you were done?
I loved it. It was so interesting to see all of the different perspectives across Europe. And some of the different challenges, the different ways in which the legislation had been implemented, and some of the challenges that people had, and to be able to, also talk from experience from the UK perspective of how we managed to get through certain issues and how we'd come together as a small group of compliance professionals in the beginning to try to set out what might be best practice and how to address things practically, because you get a regulation, it doesn't tell you how to actually practically implement it. And it was interesting just to feed into that. I think where things started to change for the UK was after Brexit, and knowing the people on the committee, they still wanted to engage. They understood that the UK rules were similar and that the UK was committed to this as an area. But I think that the dynamic very much changed because we had been very much a sort of a driving force in a number of the discussions at European level, and we had to then take a bit of a backseat. We were just sort of inputting into other bar associations, when they requested help, as opposed to being the ones that were driving forward. Any issues about meeting with MEPs, for example.
Yeah. And you said you had some interesting experience. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I think it was an education process for me. In the early days when I was a novice on that committee, we were looking at one of the forthcoming directives and the language and the drafting of that, and I had been sent over. We'd put together a very lengthy paper on an issue. And it was really focused on proportionality and also, thinking about the practical application of some of the legislation. And I went and met a colleague from the joint law societies in Brussels. And we had meetings set up with 3 MEPs, and we had this paper, and I thought the arguments were wonderful. So we had these 3 meetings set up, and the first one, we talked through the paper, and the MEP said at the end, well, it's likely I'm only going to be able to take on 1 or 2 of those points. So I'll pick my battles on this one. And I must admit, I left that room feeling slightly dejected, but was told by my colleague, no, that's actually a win. So
you made some headway.
And I learned that later, that the next meeting we had with the next MEP was scheduled for 30 minutes and lasted all of 5 minutes, as we were told, in no uncertain terms, that there wasn't going to be any watering down of any of the language in the legislation.
Wow.
Because it would certainly go against the idea that they had to be tough on crime, at a political level. And so it lasted 5 minutes. And so I thought it couldn't get any worse than that. And the third meeting, they sent a very junior individual who'd probably only been in the role, I think, for a couple of months, who knew nothing about anti-money laundering legislation whatsoever. We had to explain a lot about it. But I think in the end, we came to the conclusion that he was going to take the paper away, put it in front of the MEP and see where it got us. So I must admit, on the train home, I felt somewhat dejected. Roll on a few months, or it might have been longer than that. And one of the most interesting forums that I attended in Europe was one with some of the same MEPs who we tried to have meetings with, and where we were talking about the changes in relation to politically exposed persons. And that was the point at which they'd realised that they and their families might be affected by some of the language in the legislation. Lo and behold, those who didn't want to water down the legislation were now proposing that they watered down the legislation slightly. And I think there were a lot of wry smiles in that room that day.
That's mad. So bringing it a bit closer to home, maybe take the point on board. No, that sounds super interesting. Well, no, it sounds like you had a really great experience dealing with that. Yeah. And then you've recently left Freshfields to set up a new venture.
Just over a year ago.
Yeah. Is it just over a year? Wow. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that? What prompted that move, and then a bit more about what you do at the moment and how that's all going?
Yeah, I had been thinking about it for a while, and should I be thinking about consultancy? What was my next move? And I think a number of things sort of came together. I hadn't been particularly well, and then my mum passed away, and it's always at these moments where you start to think about life more generally, and I did think to myself, if not now, when. So that was part of the reason for doing it. So I've been working away on audits, helping clients with some of their policies and procedures. Some general compliance advice as well to some others, I mean it's a different world.
I was going to say, how have you found that transition, because you've done the fee earning piece, then in-house, and now I guess it's almost a crossover role, isn't it, because you're selling services to risk and compliance teams, presumably. So yeah, how have you found that? How have you found that change?
I think the day-to-day isn't too bad. It's the managing your own business piece that's all new.
Yeah.
But I did get some very, very good advice early on, which is if you don't really know what you're doing, go get the help, ask somebody else.
Yes, yeah.
And I think that was a key point, not to try to do everything myself in that respect. And so it was quite important to get additional support, ask others who had effectively run their own business as well, how to manage these things. And that was a sort of a key lesson for me, was to not try to do everything. And the temptation is to do everything yourself.
Yeah.
But that's a key aspect of it, is to make sure that, you know where your strengths lie and where you should be delegating that out or contracting something out. For example, VAT returns.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It's not fun when you don't want to be doing it yourself.
Not the most fun aspect.
No, absolutely. No, that sounds really exciting. Well, look, you've had an amazing career path. I know there are a couple of other things we wanted to touch on, and then I'd be keen to get some tips, I guess, for people who are looking at progressing within this space or moving into this space. But one of the things we'd touched on before, and I don't know, whether you're in your new role, you get involved in helping firms with training, but I know you'll have had a lot of experience with training.
Yeah.
We were talking about the challenges of how much training out there is valuable but might not be recordable in the way that the regulator might want to see it, and the challenges of negotiating that issue. So do you want to, I guess, expand on that? What is the issue we're talking about here?
And I think, one of the things that firms have to do as part of a visit from a regulator is to demonstrate that they have trained their staff, and therefore they're asked to produce data about what training has been provided, and to whom and when it was last done and undertaken. That can lead firms to sort of think, okay, well, I just need something like an e-learning, for example, or a general thing where people can tick that box. And I think the difficulty with that is sometimes it doesn't really get the messages across that people in the practice really need to know, really need to understand in order to spot issues. And that issue spotting comes from the stories. And it comes from the additional work that individuals in risk and compliance are doing. For example, they're going to a partner meeting, or they're going to a departmental meeting, maybe only for 15 minutes, to talk about an issue that's arisen, talk about a case study, talk about something that has been recently in the news. And often that's not actually getting recorded, but it is actually the most valuable part of the training. And I think there tends to be this focus on the e-learning, whereas I think people need to be thinking about all of the other training, all of the other value add awareness raising that they do, because often that is what really chimes with individuals. I remember a training session that I did one time, and we asked 5 questions at the outset, and everybody had to sort of answer the multiple choice questions. And a couple of years down the line, a partner said to me, I remember nothing about the rest of the training, but I do remember those 5 questions. And that has really, really stuck with me for all this time, just because I got some of those questions wrong. And I remembered getting them wrong. But really? Other people who got them right still remember those questions. And I think that's it, is sometimes it's not the telling them what the regulation is. It's not, telling them how to do things that they remember. It's the stories, it's the questions, it's those little snippets. And I think that's really, really important.
Well, they say that it's stories have been such an important thing for society as a whole, to pass on information over huge distances of space and time, not getting too deep. But I can see why that would stick, rather than an e-module that you've just done online and then there's nowhere to put that information in your brain. Is that sort of stuff? I'm really not familiar with how the regulator receives the records of training, but is that sort of stuff recordable? Is there a way to record that sort of training and get it,
I think,
ticking boxes that it needs to be ticking?
I think people are, it depends. Some are religiously recording that, others are not, and that's one of the things that I've discovered, part of some audits is, you know, I've seen some of these things, but they're not actually officially recorded as training has, you know, on this has been given. And I think that's really important. And I think with tools now, you know, in tech, you can start to record that more easily.
Absolutely.
And, you know, so that you have a better dashboard. It's not just about your formal learning management system where it records formal training for which people get their CPD or, well, you know, it's not so much that anymore, but, you know, where they're recording what they've done. But I think, you know, it varies from firm to firm, but I do think that it's really, really important to do that and find a way to do that easily.
It's interesting. There must be a huge opportunity there, isn't there? Because as soon as anything is on Zoom, it can be listened to by AI. It can be transcribed, and somewhere it's somebody, you know, the AI systems can write up those notes and record that. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Really interesting. Well, look, you've had a really fascinating career path, and you know, now in sort of, I guess, ventures new, which is exciting to be doing that. If we've got listeners who are looking to get into risk and compliance and progress a career in this space, is there advice that you would give to them to help them make the most of the opportunities in front of them?
I think if somebody's looking to get into it, I think one of the, and particularly if they've been in a private practice role, is that the role itself is not just about understanding the requirements. You need to be thinking commercially as well about how that applies. How does it apply in your business? How do you manage those risks in the business? And I think being able to demonstrate that you're capable of doing that is key to getting into that space. I remember someone in my team always used to tell new joiners, never ever go into Suzie's office and basically say, well, this is what the requirement is, without actually having thought about what you think the solution should be. She said it is better to go in with an idea where she might disagree with you than to stand there and expect her to give the answer. And I think that's really important, because that's what I think people are looking for now, people who can offer those potential solutions. And those who are the decision makers may disagree. You know, they've got a wealth of experience, but I think you also learn from that and you can start to progress. It's not just, you know, I can, you know, follow the policy. It's you're adding value. And that comes back again to what we talked about earlier, is to demonstrate to the business that you are, you know, worthwhile addition to the firm by being able to look at it from a commercial point of view as well.
Oh, I totally agree. That is very, very good advice. Well, look, Suzie, thank you so much. It's been so great having you on the podcast.
Thank you. It's been great to have a chat with you today.
We really hope you enjoyed listening to today's podcast as much as we enjoyed recording it. If you did, please do us a huge, huge favour and share it with a friend or a colleague. The more people we can get listening, the more time and energy we can get into recording more episodes and getting the best guests and the most interesting stories and insights. I want to say a huge thank you to the ICA for their support, to Ty and Karem here in the studio, and a massive thanks to Kat for making sure everything runs so smoothly behind the scenes. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, follow us on LinkedIn to make sure you never miss an episode. Thanks for listening.